Good afternoon and bon après-midi. Now we've all had a bit of a crap year this year with biking, with the lockdown, etc. So for obvious reasons, I'm looking forward to next year, hoping to do some trips. One of the things I thought of doing with my mate Mike is go back to the D-Day beaches. I haven't been there for quite a few years now. It's a bit cold at the moment and most of the museums in France are actually shut because of the lockdown. But what we can do in the winter is do some planning. Now, I've taken a bike to France probably half a dozen times. I've lost count of the number of times I've taken a car over there. So I'm aiming this video at you guys who've never been abroad before, so maybe the new bikers or those of you who've never actually got on the ferry and taken it over there. I guess the experienced guys won't learn a lot from this. So as a warning, what I'll say to you here, everything I say on here is based on my experience, my knowledge and my research, but please double check to make sure if you've got any doubts whatsoever. Right, first thing I want to look at is what paperwork that you need to go abroad. Fairly obviously, you're going to need a passport that's in date. I think with the new Brexit regs, you're going to need at least 6 months on your UK passport. You'll also need to take your driving licence, the V5, the vehicle registration document, and an insurance certificate. Now, currently, and I'm recording this New Year's Eve 2020, you are going to need a green card after tonight when the UK finally passes the transition period and is no longer part of the EU. Green cards are available from the insurance company, and unlike days of old, they don't actually have to be on green paper anymore, and I think you can print them off. Something that did concern me, and I'm not sure if this is true yet, is that you need to give the insurance company 6 weeks notice according to the government website. That seems a little bit excessive to me. That may be the case, I'm not sure, but it's something to bear in mind if you're planning a last-minute trip. The other thing that I don't think you're going to need, and again, it's a bit of a grey area at the moment, is an international driving permit. I think that's not going to apply to EU countries. It will to some other countries, but not to the EU countries. The other thing I would highly recommend that you take is medical insurance. God forbid, if you do have a spill over there, you'd have to foot the bills. French health system is excellent. I think how it works in France is that the government pay 80% of your medical bills and you take insurance out for the 20%. But if you have something like cancer or a terminal illness, the government pay it all. So it's far more civilized than the American system, but it's not free at source like the UK system. We're also going to lose our health cards with Brexit. I think there's another one in the pipeline, but no real details yet. So I would strongly recommend that you do take out some type of medical insurance. Breakdown insurance, up to you. I don't bother with it, to be honest. It would be very useful if you had to repatriate your bike after, say, for an accident. But apart from that, I don't think it's much cop. I've had it before. I had a breakdown with a car, and they basically give you credit notes, so you don't have to put your hand in your pocket to pay for the parts. Well, the garage just looked at me like I was stupid. They wouldn't take them, so I had to pay them anyway. So I don't particularly see the point of it, but again, that's a personal choice. But I do have the medical insurance, not the breakdown insurance. Now, unlike the UK, the other thing you'll need to do in France and most of Europe is carry ID on you, which will be your passport. We don't have ID cards in this country, as you know. As a point of interest, the ID cards were introduced into Europe by the Third Reich when they were occupying most of Europe. And typical of governments, when the war was over, they didn't like to release any power, which is fairly normal with the government, and our European neighbours all have to carry ID cards at all times. And it's an offence not to carry one in France. So carry your passport on you. If you are stopped by the police and you don't have one, you're going to be in trouble, probably get fined. The next thing I want to come on to is what's the best ferry route? Well, there's no right answer to that. It really depends where you're coming from in the UK. Now, I'm based in Wales, so I wouldn't use any ports near Dover unless I was, say, going to Belgium or Germany. But going to France, I would completely avoid the southeast of England from where I live. And the two major ports that really apply to South Wales would be Plymouth and Portsmouth, and I guess most of the West Country as well. They're pretty much the same distance on my home in South Wales. Which is the best route? At the end of the day, it's a balance of budget, sailing times, and distance from your chosen destination. What I'll do, I'll go through the various ports later on in the video, and you can make your mind up from there. What I would say is do not underestimate the size of France. You'll find tickets, say, for £40 one way going from Dover on the tunnel or on the ferry, and it might be over £100 from Portsmouth or Plymouth. But France is enormous. So you'll find the distance from Calais down to, say, Normandy or Brittany is huge, and you're going to be spending all that money that you've saved on a ferry ticket on fuel, hotel costs, because it takes a long old time, and probably motorway tolls if you want to get there quickly. It's not that expensive on a bike, but it all adds up. The ferry companies have worked this out. I have researched it loads of times, and it's just not cheaper. You might as well just bite the bullet and pay more and sail direct to the port that's near the destination that you want to go to. Right then, let's start with the ferry ports. I'm going to work from west to east, and let's start with Roscoff. Starting with Roscoff, Roscoff is located on the northwest coast of France, and the ferry leaves from Plymouth, and Roscoff is a really pretty little fishing village with a harbour and lovely old streets. It just happens to have a ferry terminal bolted on the end of it. The village itself is lovely. It's got windy old streets, and it's only 16 miles away from a major trunk road. It's not the nearest port to the Normandy beaches, but if you've got time on your hands, it's easy enough to reach the Normandy beaches and visit Saint-Malo and the wonderful Mont Saint-Michel on the way. Saint-Malo is the second port I'd like to introduce you to. It's my favourite crossing. It goes from Portsmouth. It's a long night crossing, meaning that you get a good night's sleep. Some of the other ferries arrive at sort of 5 and 6 in the morning. The Saint-Malo crossing arrives at 8 in the morning, and it's a good way to unwind after your long trip down to the south coast. Saint-Malo itself is a stunning town. It was bombed and destroyed in the war, but the French rebuilt it as a replica. It's full of high-end shops and restaurants. It's not cheap, but it really is worth a visit. And again, good access to major trunk roads and the rail network if you're ever in France without the bike and you want to get the train. The next port I'd like to show you is Cherbourg. It's a proper deep water port with a marina and commercial port. It's a shortish crossing, and in the summer, in normal times, even shorter if you get the high-speed ferry, which is a large aluminium catamaran. The road network starts at the edge of the town, and the first D-Day sites are only a short ride away. It's also, as a point of interest, got a decommissioned French Navy nuclear submarine in the town as well, called Le Redoutable, which is rather interesting. The last port is Caen, with a sailing from Portsmouth all year. In fact, the ferry terminal is at a town called Ouistreham, and Caen is a large city a few miles inland. Ouistreham is actually on Sword Beach, which was one of the British beaches during the D-Day invasion. It's also near the very famous Pegasus Bridge, which was liberated by the British in a glider attack, I guess you'd call it. Commandos landed in gliders, and in my opinion, this is probably the most convenient port for the D-Day beaches. Under normal circumstances, Le Havre is just a little bit further to the east, but to be perfectly frank, if you look at the cost, etc., I wouldn't bother with Le Havre. I would make Caen the final port that you would go to on this part of France. Right, the next thing I want to talk about is actually riding in France and some of the differences that you might encounter. Fairly obviously, the first and obvious one is that you ride on the right-hand side of the road, not the left-hand side of the road. Good news is, I found French motorists rather bike-friendly. They tend to expect you to overtake them. So if you're following a bike in France, most motorists will actually pull over so you can go past them, which is pretty good. One of the important things to watch out for is flashing headlights. Over here, it's usually a polite sign to mean, come on out, mate, I'm letting you go. In France, it usually means the opposite thing. It means, look out, sunshine, I'm coming through. This actually happened to me in a little town called Redon. There was a big 32-wheeler, and he flashed his lights, and I thought, oh, there's a gentleman. I nearly got bloody flattened. So be very wary of flashing lights. Having said that, if there's a police speed trap around, people still flash lights to warn you like they do over here. Again, it's illegal in France, but yeah, that's the way of the world. The other really weird rule, and you don't come across it so much now, is a thing called priority to the right, priorité à droite. It's an archaic system, and very few now, but some French roundabouts still have this system. When you drive onto the roundabout, you have to give way while you're going around the roundabout, which is completely the opposite to the UK. So you're going around the roundabout, first of all, anti-clockwise, and if somebody just decides to pull onto it, that means it's their right of way and you have to brake. They are very, very rare and you're unlikely to come across it, but just be warned. If you're coming up to a normal roundabout, 99% of them now in France, they have a sign, a roundabout sign like ours, saying in French, you don't have the priority, vous n'avez pas la priorité, which means you've got to give way before you go on the roundabout, just like the UK, so no difference there. Speed limits in France, they've been reduced on the A roads. I think they're now down to 50 mile an hour. Motorways, the speed limit on the motorway is 80 mile an hour or 130 kilometers per hour. But if the road surface is wet, that drops by 10 miles an hour, and that's the same on the dual carriageway, where the speed limit drops from 70 miles per hour to 60 miles an hour. Penalties are really, really harsh now. The French used to have lots and lots of road deaths, and as a result, a few years ago, their president put some pretty draconian measures in place. And if you're 40 kilometers per hour over the speed limit, you'll have your license confiscated. Any more than that, they will actually take your vehicle off you and crush it. So the French really slowed down, I've noticed, in the last few years, and I think they actually drive slower than us these days. Flashing amber lights is another one. When you come to a set of traffic lights in France, you might find there's, like our green infiltration arrow, they'll have an arrow that's flashing amber. And that means you can proceed with caution, but give way to things on your right. In other words, you don't have right of way, but if the road's clear, you can go. It's a little bit like if you come to a junction in the UK, it's the middle of the night, you can see all the junctions, nothing's coming. You don't go because you've got a red light. In France, you've got that option with the flashing amber light to go. So that's what it means. If it's flashing amber, you can go. And that confuses people who've never seen it before. I don't think this will probably apply to you, but if this is a fairly new rule. If you're riding into some of France's biggest cities like Paris or Lyon, you will now need to pay to get a clean air vignette, which is a sticker to go on your vehicle. Again, I've never come across that because I've never ridden in Paris in recent years or gone down to Lyon. Alcohol limits is another one I wanted to come on to. Fairly obviously, it's a bit daft if you drink and ride. But the alcohol limits in France are actually lower now than what you'll find in the UK. The limit, let's have a look, I've written it down here, it's 0.02%. But the bottom line is just don't be an idiot, don't drink and ride. Fuel costs more in France, that's just a fact of life, and the police can and do perform random stops and breathalyzer checks. I've never had any issues with the French police, just behave, and I don't think you will either. The only time I was ever pulled over, and it was really strange, I was with my wife, 2 little kids in the car many years ago, and they were just doing random checks, and I thought they'd ignore me having a foreign plate, but they didn't, and they made sure I had all my documentation, my passport, etc. It's only happened once to me in 35 years, but nevertheless it does happen. Next thing I want to talk about is rules for motorbikes, how to get your bike ready for a trip to France. First of all, high-vis. You're required to carry a high-vis jacket but not wear one in France, but if you break down and don't have one, you will be fined, and the same applies to a pillion. So in effect, they're mandatory. You will often find even French motorists, they've got them on the back of their seat, because technically if they get out the car to get a high-vis jacket from the boot, they're breaking the law. So people keep them actually on the seat so the police don't get funny with them. Breathalyzers, contrary to what you'll see on some of the websites, breathalyzers do not need to be carried. I won't bore you with the complex history of the law, but don't let anyone try and sell you one. You don't need one. Helmet stickers, this is another really weird one. You don't need the 5 reflective helmet stickers required by French law unless you are a French rider or your helmet was bought in France. To be fair, even some of the French ignore this rule. It's a bonkers French rule, but not an EU rule. As you probably know, EU rules supersede national rules, so the French in their wisdom decided to come up with this bonkers idea of putting stickers on your helmet. The EU rules don't agree with that. No rule has been passed as such in the EU, so if you're from another EU country, you do not need to put the stickers on your helmet, unless you bought, say, the helmet in France. So it's a daft rule, so don't put stickers on. I have done in the past. Basically, if I was ever pulled over by a gendarme who didn't know the law, I thought I can do without the hassle. But I've just spent a fortune on a new crash helmet and I don't want to put these daft stickers on it. Then we got spare bulbs. Despite what the expert in the pub says and some websites, you do not need to carry a spare bulb kit, although in my opinion it's a good idea just in case. If you do have a bulb go, there's plenty of auto shops as well in France where you can buy a spare, but for the peace of mind, I usually do take a spare bulb kit with mine just in case, and it could happen on a Saturday or the bank holiday over there. So rather than run around without having a headlight bulb, I always take one with me. Another odd rule, makes sense, but again, I've never seen it. It's sort of enforced, but it does make sense. If you wear spectacles, you're meant to carry a spare pair. I say I've never known anybody pull for this, but it is actually a law in France. And the other thing that is illegal are in-ear headphones. That includes things like intercoms, sat-navs, in-ear headphones. One of the other things that's illegal are speed detectors. If you've got a sat-nav with speed detectors, I believe you need to, camera detectors, I should say, speed camera detectors, you need to disable that function that shows you where you are, that according to French law. Again, I've never seen anybody pulled in for that, but that's the law over there. Headlights, luckily on motorbikes, headlights point straight ahead. They're not like a car where they'll dip to one side or the other. If you drive a British car in France, a right-hand drive car, your headlights dip to the left, which would dazzle a French driver, so you need to mask them off. Bike headlights go straight ahead, so you don't need to do any masking. Apart from that, that's everything I can think of that you need to get the bike ready for France. I tend to take things along like a puncture repair kit, or a can of goo to inflate the tyre if I have a puncture. But generally speaking, they're the important things you need to think about before you go. I'm assuming that most of you watching this video haven't been to the D-Day beaches before, so I'll give you a little bit of background on the area and on the beaches themselves and points around there. The map you're looking at the moment is the stretch of coastline the landings took place. In the bottom right hand of the map you'll see the town of Ouistreham, that's where the ferry lands, and then the 5 D-Day beaches sweep right the way round to the left hand side of the map on the Cherbourg Peninsula. In fact, there were 6 beaches for D-Day, but one of them's been forgotten. To the east of the Caen-Ouistreham Canal, there was a beach called Band, B-A-N-D. And luckily, it never needed to be used because the Royal Navy managed to silence most of the guns there, so the troops were deployed to another beach. In fact, the British beaches were all named after fish. Band, bandfish, swordfish, jellyfish, and goldfish. But the Canadians were given the beach which was codenamed Jelly. They didn't like the name and they changed it to Juno and dropped the fish. So the beaches go from east to west: Sword, Juno, Gold, Omaha and Utah. And Omaha and Utah are the American beaches. I'll take you through those now. Starting with Sword Beach, this was one of the British beaches, and the soldiers that landed there were from mainly Great Britain, but also Poland, the Free French and Norwegian forces. It's a 5-mile long beach, and this is the beach that the Brittany ferry actually lands on. The British managed to deploy 29,000 men on this beach, and the beach casualties were relatively, and I say that with the greatest respect, relatively light. Most of the casualties then occurred after, when the troops were advancing inwards. When you get to Sword Beach, it's definitely worth going to see Pegasus Bridge. The canal that runs from the port of Ouistreham to Caen, on the east side of that were German panzers during the war, and by taking Pegasus Bridge, that effectively made a barrier with the canal between the British soldiers landing and the German armoured vehicles on the east-hand side. The next beach along is Juno Beach. This was allocated to the Canadian forces and they were assisted by the Free French, the British and the Norwegians. This beach sadly took heavy casualties. Problem was, on the land, Hitler had his Atlantic Wall full of gun emplacements and the naval bombardment didn't take out all of the guns, hence the casualties on this beach. Then to the west of this beach, we've got Gold Beach, which was another British beach, and the British were assisted by the Poles and the Dutch. That took an estimated 1,000 casualties, and the 8th Armoured Division, i.e. the Desert Rats, landed there. And on a personal note, I actually used to have a customer who landed with the 8th Army. He was a Desert Rat and an armoured car commander on Gold Beach on D-Day +2, so it was my honour, really, to ferry him round in the taxi. Also, I've got a friend in France who's probably now 95, and he was there as a young man. He was 18, and he had a lorry license. And when the Allies landed, he volunteered to drive a truck for the Allies, and they obviously needed him, and he drove a lorry for them and joined the French army after the war. And he lost an arm in Indochina, and at Bastille Day a few years ago, he was wearing his medals and a beret, and the beret looked like one of our British paratrooper berets. And I asked him about it. He said it was, and it was presented to him by Her Majesty the Queen nonetheless. He didn't tell me what he did to earn it, but I suspect he'd done something pretty spectacular to get a British paratrooper's red beret from Her Majesty. So Gold Beach has sort of got quite a place in my heart. And slightly to the west of Gold Beach is the town of Arromanches. Now, I haven't marked it on here. The Allies didn't have a harbour in France because obviously the Germans occupied them. So they had this crazy idea of making one and towing it over the channel and basically making an artificial harbour. And that's at the town of Arromanches. And the harbour is called the Mulberry. And they also needed fuel. And they ran a pipeline under the sea. And that was called Pluto. The acronym stands for Pipeline Under the Ocean, which took all the fuel to obviously power the lorries and the tanks and all the other vehicles that the Allies had put ashore. Definitely worth going to because the harbour was only meant to last a short time, but you still see wrecks of it now just off the coast at Arromanches. Definitely worth a visit if you're over there. Next we come on to Omaha Beach. This was one of the American beaches. The Germans were well dug in here and had strong defences, and a lot of the planning that went into taking this beach actually went awry, resulting in heavy casualties for the Americans. This was the beach that was made famous in the film Saving Private Ryan, and you probably get a little bit of a sense of the horror if you've ever seen that movie. The Germans also had quite a few thousand experienced combat troops as well, bearing in mind a lot of the Americans had never actually seen any action until they landed in Normandy. And just to the west of Omaha Beach, which I'll talk about later, was a big gun emplacement called Point du Hoc. And the Germans had actually moved their guns inland unknown to the Allies, but the US Rangers scaled the cliffs to try and take those gun emplacements. But the guns had moved. So the Rangers actually joined the forces that were assaulting Omaha Beach, and they were instrumental in actually establishing an American bridgehead at Omaha. The last beach is Utah. This was also an American beach. The Americans managed to land 21,000 men there with fairly light casualties. The reason for this was the landings were supported by the American airborne troops, mainly the 101st Airborne. They were made famous, of course, in Band of Brothers. And there were three big guns facing Utah Beach, and Major Winters of the 101st took out those three guns with just a handful of men. They were outnumbered about 3-1, which obviously saved a lot of American lives. And the other thing we mustn't forget is that 60,000 French civilians were killed as a result of D-Day, from bombing before the landings and during the landings. So that's something that tends to be forgotten, but yeah, they lost 60,000 civilians, which is, if you think about it, it's pretty awful. I've just marked a few points of interest on this map that you might be interested in. There are so many things to see in Normandy, I won't cover them all, and they're all on the internet and guidebooks, etc. I briefly mentioned Point du Hoc before. That was where the Germans had a lot of gun emplacements. It was heavily bombed by the Allies, and the gun emplacements were huge. And if you have a look at them these days, they're actually tilted because they've blown off their foundations. If you think about it, it must have been absolutely terrifying. But the Germans moved the guns inland, so they weren't there to actually fire on Omaha Beach from that position. And then just inland, you can see the town I've marked there of Saint-Mère-Église. That was the first town liberated in France. That is well worth a visit. That was liberated by the 101st. And to this day, there's a dummy of an American paratrooper hanging from the church, and that actually happened in real life, and I think that was made famous in one of the films. And he pretended to be dead, and the Germans didn't shoot him. I think his name is John Steele, and he died in 1966. But Saint-Mère-Église is well worth going. The museum there is actually shaped like a massive parachute, and inside is actually Clark Gable's raincoat. Clark Gable took part in 3 bombing runs against his management's advice over Germany, so 10 out of 10 to the man. And then there's also a German gun battery, which is worth a visit, Kriesbeck, which is again marked on the map there. But there's plenty of other things to see and do as well. So that just gives you a little bit of a taste of what's around there. When I go over later this year, I'm going to follow the coast road around the beaches, so nothing fast. It's not really a trip to go for a good thrash of the motorbike. It's just going to be a gentle bimble along the coast to have a look at all the places of interest that occurred there 75 years ago. Well folks, that's come to the end of the part 1 of this video of planning and preparation for a trip to Normandy. I had a couple of thoughts since I last did some filming yesterday. Another thing I'd take with me are enough spanners to adjust the chain while I'm abroad. And the other thing, not particularly nice subject, half a roll of bog roll. If you do get short when you're going through France, a lot of the little towns and villages have public toilets, but a lot of the time they're not particularly nice and they often don't have loo paper in there, so that will save you using your baseball cap or your t-shirt. Keep that for something else. Anyway, if you like this video, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Hope you found it useful. See you soon. Bye-bye.